Hello everyone, welcome to Scpodcast, your student podcast on digital culture. Today we will talk about state and government regulations on social media with our panelists and raise many questions as we delve into our discussion.
So, in the 90s and early 2000s, the internet appeared as a new hope for liberties, freedom of expression, and the emergence of critical perspectives. The internet seemed to be inaccessible to governments that actually saw it as a threat, and started to try and regulate it. Hence, it would give a voice to oppressed populations who could speak to the world, or simply allow the common people to raise their voice about societal topics. But what happens now that governments succeed in limiting its use to fit their interest? The development highly participated in the globalization process by becoming a tool for soft power. Besides, the great global powers are the ones making use of more regulations concerning citizens' access to the web and social media. We can already outline two major issues here in the race for apps regulations: the influence stakes, soft power, so to say, and the great power competition. Hence, we will ask ourselves along this podcast to what extent governmental restrictions on the use of social media are power-induced.
So to answer this question, we focused on different academic articles since it covered different issues that were interesting to our topic. From regulations and censorship to protest and activism, by focusing on those papers, we managed to cross sources, so meta-analysis. We also used documents like maps to dig deeper into the findings of the academic papers we focused on. By crossing the interviews, surveys, and research led by the authors of the articles, we are able to find new data and connect ideas. We also searched into the regulations of different countries, such as the US, Russia, India, and China. We also used the website Freedom House, to find figures and official data in order to bring objectivity to our research.
So now, to contextualize some more, social media are nowadays used by more than 4.5 billion people in 2022, and TikTok, more precisely, by 1 billion people in 2023. Hence, their scope in our daily lives is huge, often presented as a way to protect the population's data, or even as a way to guard national security. We will try to understand to what extent those restrictions are in reality rather influenced by the fear of being spied, and by the fear of seeing a population manipulated. To impose those restrictions on such lucrative and popular applications showcases real power from the states, the power being the ability or capacity to do something or act in a particular way. The paradox here, and it is where lies the interest of our subject, is that those governmental restrictions for the good of the population actually impact the agency of the users of the app. We've seen through the Arab Springs the protestation capacity of the use of these apps. On that, we have breaking news. Elisabeth Borne, the French Prime Minister, declared in October that she wants to authorize digital banning of users for up to 6 months, as she thinks social media played a key role in Nanterre riots for Nahel. To answer, let us take a dive in the different regulations in India, Russia, China, and the US. So, Alicia, could you tell us more about China, please?
Sure. China has a long history in terms of internet regulations. In the early 90s, the Chinese government decided to allow the access to the internet to its citizens, believing that it would make it closer to the rest of the world. From 1987 to 1996, the internet stayed unregulated in China. However, little by little, the government started to consider the threat that it could represent for the prosperity of the regime and the ideology. Starting lightly, the country first introduced in 1996 the temporary regulations for the management of computer information network international connection. This first regulation prohibited any form of cyberbullying and hate speech, but it also stated the protection of freedom and privacy of network users by the law in its Article 7. It placed the government as the responsible for the protection of network activities and started preventing users from trying to overthrow the government. This regulation set a framework for the following ones. The temporary nature of this regulation permitted to gently pave the way for others. From the year 2000, the state started implementing more and more regulation to replace the first one. These new regulations became even more specific and restrictive. The measures for managing internet information services more commonly known as the measures, were put in place to set the basis of governmental surveillance of internet activities. From now on, internet providers had to manage the use of the connection by their users. The measures led to restrictions of public spaces providing internet access, such as internet cafe. So the regulation on internet cafe, implemented in 2002, stated that the owner is responsible for monitoring the consumer. For these regulations to take effect, the government created tools for surveillance and for blocking websites and proxies. It even started developing fake proxies as traps to see who would be tempted to engage with illegal practices. Regarding users' interdiction on the internet, the regulations stayed very vague. The government did not set a specific framework of rules, so users would be subject to its interpretation and sanctions the users more easily. Pretty much every behavior could be qualified of threatening the regime. In that way, both the internet users and internet providers lived in constant fear of being found and sanctioned by the government.
All right, now let us move to India with Emma.
Yes, so in India, the most important legal act towards the digital sphere is India's Information Technology Act, notified in October 2000. This act laid the foundations for effective regulation of e-commerce, cybercrime, and online content, which is what we are interested in today. The legal act in itself remains fairly simple, with the core idea of protecting citizens from unwanted harm through information technologies and, most importantly, secure national security. However, some sections of this IT Act are interesting to talk about when evoking state control and regulation of the media and the digital sphere. Section 69A is one of them. As stated in India's Ministry of Electronics and Information Technology, Section 69A of IT Act allows the government to issue content blocking orders to online intermediaries such as internet service providers, telecom service providers, web hosting services, search engines, online marketplace, and so on. Simply put, it gives the ability for the government to completely block the public access of some online information through computer resources. This gives the government tremendous power to censor any information that they would judge harmful to the security of the country. This also allows the government to pursue their own undue digital sovereignty plans. Article 69A was used in 2020 as a proxy to secure Indian security interests and sovereignty in the digital sphere. The Chinese-owned social media platform TikTok, along with 59 other mobile apps, were banned by the Indian government on the basis of Section 69A of the IT Act of 2000. This was done due to purely geopolitical tensions. The Indian government worrying that too much information from Indian TikTok users would be accessible by China. China and India can indeed be called competitors, as they have several conflicting interests. India has some issues with China, notably border disputes with the Chinese army, conflicting regime types, different domestic and foreign policies, and heavy trade imbalance with impacts the Indian economy negatively in comparison to the Chinese economy. This decision to ban TikTok in India was not such a neutral decision, but in truth, this decision was power-induced and can be translated as a tour de force on the Indian side, against its neighboring rival, which is China. So, banning TikTok in India inspired a similar decision done by the US government, which we will now talk about with Marjorie.
Alright, so the Restrict Act in March 2023 was presented as a way to ban TikTok nationwide. It was introduced by a bipartisan group, so Democrats and Republicans, of senators. The bill, if passed, wouldn't target TikTok specifically. Instead, it would authorize the Secretary of Commerce, under orders of the President, to restrict or ban digital products and services from countries it deems to be foreign adversaries, so to say China, Cuba, Iran, North Korea, Russia, and Venezuela. Should a US-based person or company violate a restriction issued under the Restrict Act, they would be subject to penalties, so fines and up to 20 years of imprisonment. We can ask ourselves if the Restrict Act is the appropriate way to ban TikTok. So the first critique is that the broad language in the Restrict Act would criminalize the use of a VPN, significantly impacting access to security tools and other applications. Another critique is the idea that the Chinese government can get data about American consumers in 1,000 different ways. So banning software from the country can be perceived as a political anti-China bashing. And lastly, the last critique could be that the Restrict Act has been perceived by a part of the population as an invasion of their free speech rights. So the suggested ban comes on the heels of several states banning TikTok from government-supplied devices, including Louisiana and Texas, among others. So the Restrict Act was basically perceived as giving too much power to the executive and as threatening the First Amendment of the Constitution. Hence, a new bill has been written. It is called the Guard Act, and it's basically the same as the Restrict Act, but without the First Amendment concerns. It was published in October 2023. So the real question posed by this legislative attempt is to what extent should American technology companies separate themselves from Chinese ones? Indeed, the Chinese technology companies are deeply linked to the American way of life, but are at the same time under the control of an increasingly authoritarian and antagonistic government. So this is why we're going to take a look at Russia right now with Clara.
In Russia, according to the Freedom House website, 80% of the population has access to the internet. However, even if the vast majority of residents have access to it, that doesn't mean it is completely unrestricted. The Russian government has implemented a series of laws and regulations aimed at extending its control over the internet and, by extension, social media platforms. These measures are often seen as tools to maintain and consolidate political power, limit freedom of expression, and monitor online activities. The Sovereign Internet Law, which aims at centralizing the internet, and other regulations like the Yarovaye Law from 2016, which is officially known as the Federal Law on Counterterrorism, and which requires internet service providers to store the user's data for a specified period, grant the government greater power to control and monitor internet usage. However, the Yaragova Law, targeting online extremism and terrorism, has been criticized for being broadly defined and sometimes used to suppress political opposition and silence critical voices on social media platforms. By having the capability to isolate Russian internet from the global network and to access user data stored within Russia, the government gains influence over the digital sphere, especially with the introduction of measures aimed at creating a sovereign internet or a RUNET, separating the Russian internet from the rest of the world. These measures can be seen as a means to ensure that the government can assert its authority and maintain order, particularly in times of political unrest or public dissent. It was greatly reinforced by the invasion of Ukraine. In fact, social networks such as Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter had their access blocked in February and March 2022, and 5,000 websites were blocked. In addition to the laws, Roskomnadzor, as the regulatory agency overseeing these measures, plays a central role in enforcing these restrictions, and is under the control of the Ministry of Digital Development, Communication and Mass Media. Its actions, including blocking websites and monitoring online content, are seen as power-induced actions aimed at maintaining political control and limiting freedom of expression on social media platforms. The governmental restrictions on the use of social media in Russia are largely serving as instruments for the Russian government to assert authority, control information, and suppress dissent, ultimately impacting the extent of internet and social media freedom in the country.
Well, thank you very much for this small tour of the restrictions in different countries. But now, concretely, what are the main hypotheses we're holding? First, we believe that restrictions are imposed on applications not only for societal needs, but mainly for political ones. So to say, the soft power influence and the great power competition. Also, we believe that the distinction between the type of regimes on that restriction topic is thin. We are now going to see two case studies, so both in the US and in Russia. So for the US, we want to do a short study of the Black Lives Matter movement through two articles. So social media platforms have served as venues for political engagement and social activism. Across Pew Research Center surveys, Black social media users have been particularly likely to say that these sites are personally important to them for getting involved with issues they care about or finding like-minded people. Black and Hispanic users use the platforms for this purpose compared with white social media users. Hence, we see that social media are an opportunity for minorities to voice their struggle. We can decline the use of social media in 3 political activities: finding other people who share their views about important issues, getting involved with political or social issues that are important to them, and giving them a venue to express their political opinions. In almost each case, the Black users have the most important share compared to Hispanic or white users. Black Lives Matter started in 2013. Black Lives Matter started in 2013 with the hashtag Black Lives Matter. Activists started using it more systematically from 2014 on. The first wave took place on Twitter. The second wave took place on Instagram in 2020 with the hashtag Justice for George Floyd. It facilitated the 2020 Black Lives Matter protest. However, the video of the murder of George Floyd was first uploaded on Facebook. Then celebrities and ordinary people started posting a single black square on their Facebook and Instagram timelines to denounce systematic racism. We can see here that the type of social media matters little, because both Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram has been used, but that there are tools in themselves to take actions. So now, what about Russia?
So as an opposition to the US, according to where they stand on the political system spectrum, Russia also has its instances where social media were used to coordinate political engagement. Happening in 2021, the Alexei Navalny protests are deemed, according to this article by the New York Times, as being the biggest dissent Russia has faced in years. Social media has played a huge role in these protests, being the place where thousands of videos of Russian protesters defying the government were spread on the media. These videos show demonstrators being carried away by the police, or others throwing snowballs and kicking cars belonging to the FSB, Russia's domestic intelligence agency. These sightings on social media are extremely surprising, knowing the heavy repression in Russia by police and the very rare occurrences of popular protests in the country. Hundreds of demonstrators were detained and mistreated by the police as a consequence for their activism. The use of social media to spread these videos of courageous Russian protesters were well received in the world and was a way to energize the movement within Russia through anonymous online support. Pro-Navalny and such anti-government movements are not very popular in Russia. However, social media clout enabled to galvanize the support of many young Russians who bravely took to the streets. Indeed, according to a statistograph issued by the Levada Center in July 2020, 29% of Russians said to want to participate in a local large-scale protest, the percentage being of only 8% back in August 2014. This example has proven the efficiency, the feat even, of social media platforms in being able to organize political activism to such an extent in countries like Russia. This case study could be a hopeful path towards the democratization of Russia, which since the year 2000 have spiraled down the path of authoritarianism with Putin's accession to power.
Well, thank you very much. So now, what are the main findings we can get from these case studies?
So our study showed that the internet can be a tool for emancipation and revolt, but in that sense, it means that it also becomes a threat for the order within the state. Governments are thus tempted to limit its citizens' access or possibilities on the web and social media. Our analysis of internet regulation in for great powers, so namely Russia, China, India, and the US, portrayed 2 main motives for governments to restrict the internet. China and Russia made use of regulations as tools for surveillance in order to perpetuate the ongoing censorship and the authority of the regime. In contrast, India, with its IT Act, and the US, with its new federal bill, decided to restrict the access to TikTok for geopolitical reasons. India was the first one to ban TikTok in order to boycott the Chinese money-making plans. This restriction was the result of geopolitical tensions between the countries. Boycotting Chinese firms appeared as an efficient means to fight the Chinese influence on the economy. With this decision, India made ByteDance lose its biggest living wage, so $5 million per year. The Indian IT Act banning TikTok inspired the federal bill carried out by the US. Even though the latter claimed to protect its citizens' data from reaching the Chinese government, the reason that comes out is mainly the ban of a Chinese and so a rival firm making its business worldwide. We focused on two concrete cases of the use of social media to take political action. On the one hand, the US, with the movement Black Lives Matter, placed social media at the center of a social struggle against systemic racism in the US. After the murder of George Floyd by police officers in 2020, the movement spread and reached a great number of people joining the fight. It even became a crucial political tool in the run-up to the elections to get the interest of the voters. People supporting the movement were more likely to vote for the Democrats, and on the contrary, people who opposed it would be more attracted by the Republican Party. On the other hand, we have Russia with the wave of protests resulting from the arrest of Alexei Navalny that also made social media become the place to denounce Putin's authoritarianism. Many videos of the protests were shared and encouraged a much greater number of people to take part in the fight. Here, social media widened the opposition between the population and the government. So in both cases, social media were a way to politicize certain societal topics and reach a certain influence, giving voice to the people. But depending on the values supported by the regime, these actions were welcomed differently. We analyzed 4 countries with a different level of democracy each. The Freedom House Index gave us an indicator of the liberties on the digital sphere in those 4 countries. China gets the grade of 9 out of 100 in terms of internet freedom, and Russia at 21 out of 100, which earns them both to be placed in the category not free. So both of them do not exceed 5 out of 100 in terms of limit of content, which means that they make a great use of restrictions. India, with its overall 59 out of 100, is considered partly free, and the US is free with a grade of 76 out of 100. The results do not seem surprising, as democracy in China and Russia are practically non-existent, and as India is getting an autocratic turnover since 2014 and Modi's rise to power. However, putting together all our elements, and even if the Freedom House Index shows significant discrepancies in liberties for 4 objects of study, they all implemented restrictions either for a particular social media or of website, and therefore limited their population's use of the internet and its services. Even if their claims for implementing restrictions vary, the result is the same. Without their agreement, the populations are prevented from using the digital sphere, which at its beginning was presented as a free space that was not regulable by political or governmental bodies. And so these populations are prevented from using the digital sphere as they want, even if it does not properly harm anyone, such as with the question of the ban of TikTok for geopolitical purposes. So overall, restrictions implemented by governments seem to be power-induced, either at the national level to protect the state's interests, or at the global level when it aims at limiting the influence of other rival powers on the population. Both the authorities and the populations can make political use of the internet and social media, which becomes a threat for both sides.
Okay, well, so we hence still need to think of a way to both protect the population without making it lose in agency. For our next episode, we would like to study more the perception of the restrictions by the population to operate a change of scale in our analysis.
Well, thank you to our panelists today, and see you at the next episode.
See you!